John Lennon is famously on record for saying some very interesting things about the Rolling Stones. In short, what he claimed was that the Stones had copied the Beatles over and over, musically, visually, and even conceptually. Let's listen into him talk right here.
He imitates us, and I'd like one of you underground people to point it out, Let It Bleed. Satanic Majesties is pepper. I resent the implication that the Stones are like revolutionaries and that the Beatles weren't, If the Stones were or are, the Beatles really were. They're not in the same class, music-wise or power-wise. Never were, and Mick always resented it.
So Lennon didn't mince any words in that quote. What he's saying is that the Rolling Stones basically just copied everything that the Beatles did, and if it weren't for the Beatles, they wouldn't have even been able to get their start, because the Beatles showed them the way to do everything they did. Now stick around, because I'm going to tell you some things that Mick Jagger had to say about the Beatles, and I'm actually going to play a few quotes of what he said. So is Lennon right, or was he just a bit of a megalomaniac here? First thing to talk about is that the Beatles and the Stones were actually friends in the early days. They hung out, they respected each other, and they watched each other very closely. And what's even more important, maybe, is that Lennon and McCartney actually wrote the first hit song that the Rolling Stones ever had, which is a song called I Wanna Be Your Man. This song gave the Stones momentum at a critical time. And later, Lennon said that this was Exhibit A in the argument that the Stones keyed off of what the Beatles did. So over the years, John Lennon made several claims that the Stones repeatedly ripped off the Beatles, and here are the main ones. If the Beatles innovated something, the Stones responded. So this was the basic pattern. When the Beatles made Sgt. Pepper's, the Stones made Their Satanic Majesties Request. And when the Beatles put out Let It Be, the Stones put out Let It Bleed. And Lennon also believed that the Stones watched everything the Beatles did, including the way they handled publicity, album concepts, presentation, timing, and even their in-studio behavior. Now, to be fair, Mick Jagger has admitted most of what Lennon said here, but puts a different spin on it.
Later on, they gave us our first big hit in England, which was a song they wrote called I Want to Be Your Man. And we were very grateful for that, because that really broke us in England. And but the example of the way they wrote and the original way that they crafted their songs wasn't lost on us. And later on, their success in America broke down a lot of doors that helped everyone else from England that followed. And I thank them very much for all those things.
Jagger has basically said that the Beatles opened the doors. The Beatles absorbed the initial shock of fame, came over to America, showed how to do it. The Beatles taught everyone, including the Rolling Stones, what a modern global rock band could be back in the 60s. So the Beatles definitely paved the road, and Jagger doesn't argue that. But I think this is where things get a little bit complicated, because musically, the Stones and the Beatles could not be any further apart. And basically, you can find clips of Paul McCartney saying what I'm about to say here. It comes down to this. The Beatles were like a progressive pop band, and the Rolling Stones were a blues band. They're rawer, looser, more groove-driven, and they're focused on feel and swagger. So, sure, the Stones watched how the Beatles handled fame, albums, and presentation, and they would have been crazy not to, because the Beatles were the biggest band in the world. So for me, the Beatles seem to aim for the mind and the imagination, whereas the Stones aim for the hips and the barroom, and they intersect and they influence each other, but they don't really sound alike. And if you doubt me, make a playlist today of your favorite Rolling Stones and favorite Beatles songs on the same playlist and stagger them so that they alternate. You won't hear many similarities at all. And one of the main differences, of course, is that the Rolling Stones are not a vocal harmony-based band. And the other one is, as I say, the Stones are a blues-based band. And they've never pretended to be otherwise. Just like they've never pretended that they weren't opportunists when it came to their image, their culture, and their publicity. They watched what worked, and they used what they could. So to me, that's not necessarily imitation. It's a form of survival. And they didn't continue to copy the Beatles after the Beatles were no longer paving the original road. So I think in this particular case, I disagree with John Lennon, but I really admire him for being blunt, provocative, and exaggerating just a little bit to make his point, which isn't entirely wrong. The Rolling Stones did look to the Beatles as an example, but they didn't want to be the Beatles. They wanted to be the Rolling Stones. They wanted to be bigger than the Beatles. So now I'll throw it out to you. Do you think the Rolling Stones copied the Beatles too much, as Lennon says here, or is Lennon getting a bit carried away? And do you hear much similarity in their music? Because this is where I think they really take different roads. In my opinion, they don't really sound anything alike. Let me know what you think down in the comments below.
Music Guru here, asking you to help us on our march to 10,000 subscribers.